In the quiet chill of December 1936, at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, a ship was born from steel, sweat, and the hard dreams of a struggling nation. Her name was USS Helena, CL-50. She was not yet a legend, not yet the machine gun cruiser. But the men who built her, and the men who would one day fight aboard her, were about to write a chapter of naval history that would echo across the Pacific for generations. The Great Depression had left America weary but unbroken. Factories stood silent, shipyards idle, and breadlines stretched down city streets. Yet, in that same era of hardship, the United States Navy began to rebuild, quietly, methodically, preparing for a world that didn't yet realize how close it was to war. The St. Louis-class light cruisers represented a new way of thinking. Fast, agile, and armed with more firepower than any ship of their kind before. They were designed not to sit back, but to move, strike, and survive. When her keel was laid down in 1936, few could have imagined the destiny awaiting hull number 50. She was 608 feet of steel determination, 61 feet across the beam, and capable of slicing through the Pacific at over 32 knots. Her heart was powered by 4 Parsons turbines and 8 roaring boilers that could unleash 100,000 horsepower. But her soul, her true soul, was her main battery, 15 6-inch guns, arranged in 5 triple turrets. Each gun could hurl a 130-pound shell 10 miles, and when fired together, they could unleash a broadside that sounded like thunder ripping through the sea. It was these guns, and the men who manned them, that would one day earn Helena her nickname, the machine gun cruiser. On August 27, 1938, she slipped into the East River for the first time. Her hull gleamed with new paint, her deck spotless, her crew eager and proud. Crowds cheered as champagne shattered across her bow, christening her with Luck. But luck, as history would show, would be a complicated thing for Helena. Her early voyages were peaceful, goodwill missions, training cruises, and ceremonial duties. She visited Uruguay in 1939. Her crew staring out at the wreck of the German pocket battleship Graf Spee, scuttled in Montevideo after the Battle of the River Plate. For young American sailors, it was a chilling sight. The twisted metal, the blackened hull, the silent proof of modern naval warfare. Many wondered quietly, would their ship one day share the same fate? By 1940, Helena was reassigned to the Pacific Fleet, based in Hawaii. There, she trained relentlessly, gunnery drills, damage control, and navigation exercises that turned sailors into warriors. The days were long, the sea endless, and the discipline absolute. No one yet knew that this peaceful paradise was about to become hell. In the final months of 1941, Helena entered Pearl Harbor's Navy Yard for upgrades. New anti-aircraft batteries were being fitted, including the powerful 1.1-inch Chicago pianos. To most sailors, it was just another refit. But to history, it was a fateful decision, because on December 7, 1941, Helena wasn't supposed to be where she was. That morning dawned calm and golden over Oahu. The mountains were draped in soft mist, the harbor waters smooth as glass. Helena rested quietly at Berth 1010, moored alongside the old mine layer Oglala. Across the harbor, the battleships, Arizona, West Virginia, Oklahoma, California, Nevada, and others, stood in proud formation, their massive hulls reflecting the morning sun. At 7:55 a.m., the world changed forever. 9 Japanese torpedo bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Muota, swept in low over the harbor entrance. Their leader's target was the battleship Pennsylvania, usually moored at Helena's berth. But fate had switched their places. Through the haze and confusion, Helena's silhouette looked close enough. The first torpedo dropped just 300 yards away, its silver body slicing through the water like a predator. Seconds later, it struck Helena on her starboard side, just below the armor belt. The explosion was deafening, a roar that tore through the harbor and sent shockwaves through steel and flesh alike. In an instant, her forward engine room was obliterated. Boilers burst, steam scalded men alive, and seawater poured in through a jagged hole large enough to drive a truck through. Oglala, moored alongside, absorbed part of the blast and began to roll over. Helena shuddered, her decks buckling, her compartments flooding, but she did not die. Within 2 minutes, power was rerouted. Diesel generators hummed to life, and even as Japanese bombers wheeled overhead for their second pass, Helena's anti-aircraft guns opened fire. From her shattered decks rose the first defiant bursts of flak, bright traces arching toward the enemy. The men of Helena fought back with everything they had. Smoke filled the passageways. Below decks, sailors struggled to plug ruptured bulkheads as water surged in. Above, gun crews manned their stations even as bombs rained around them. The air was filled with the smell of burning oil, cordite, and blood. One sailor later wrote, "We were hit, we were bleeding, but we were not broken. Every man who could still move fought." By the time the attack ended, Helena had been hit by one torpedo and strafed by nemesis that showered her deck with shrapnel. 40 of her men lay dead, over 100 wounded. And yet, against all odds, she stayed afloat. She was the only major combat ship struck by a torpedo at Pearl Harbor that survived the day. The Japanese pilots believed they had sunk her. They were wrong. Helena would rise again, angrier, faster, deadlier than ever before. In the days that followed, she was patched and pumped dry, her crew refusing to abandon their ship. Within 48 hours, she was in dry dock, her wounds being stitched with steel. Yard workers labored around the clock, sparks flying like stars as welders sealed her hull. It was as if the ship herself refused to rest. By January 1942, she was strong enough to make the dangerous voyage to Mare Island, California, a journey that tested every patch, every plate, and every man aboard. Through heavy seas, Helena limped eastward, her hull creaking but holding. Her sailors stood ready at the pumps, determined to keep her alive. When she reached Mare Island, she was greeted not as a crippled vessel, but as a survivor, a symbol of Pearl Harbor's defiance. The workers who met her understood that this ship was special. She had taken Japan's best punch and stayed standing. But what emerged from that shipyard over the next few months wasn't just a repaired cruiser. It was something reborn. Helena was refitted with state-of-the-art radar, the new USG surface search system, capable of seeing through fog and darkness. Her anti-aircraft batteries were doubled, and her bridge redesigned for better visibility. The lessons of Pearl Harbor were burned into her steel. When she sailed out again, she was leaner, smarter, and ready for vengeance. Her new crew trained with fanatic intensity. They drilled day and night, learning to fight in the dark, to track enemies with radar, to repair damage in seconds. Each man aboard knew what they were fighting for. They had seen friends die under burning skies. They carried that memory with them into every gunnery drill, every sleepless watch, every whisper of the sea. By July 1942, USS Helena CL-50 was no longer a survivor. She was a hunter, and as she steamed westward beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, her crew lined the rails. Some waved toward the shoreline, toward wives and sweethearts and families who waited. Others stared silently into the Pacific, toward the enemy who had once thought her dead. The machine gun cruiser was going back to war. The summer of 1942 marked a turning point. Across the vast Pacific, America was clawing back from the shock of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Empire still stretched from Burma to the Gilbert Islands, but for the first time, U.S. forces were on the offensive. And leading the push into the South Pacific was a ship that had already defied death, USS Helena CL-50. Refitted, rearmed, and reborn, Helena joined the newly formed Task Force 67, part of Admiral William Bull Hall's hard-hitting South Pacific Fleet. Her orders were simple but brutal: protect supply lines, bombard enemy bases, and hunt the Imperial Navy in the night. In those waters, the Solomon Islands, stretching like a jagged scar between New Guinea and the Coral Sea, war had become personal. The Navy called the area the Slot, a narrow channel cutting through the Solomons, where destroyers and cruisers fought desperate, close-range battles under cover of darkness. It was a place of ghosts and fire. Every night, searchlights flashed, shells screamed, and ships vanished beneath boiling water. To the men who sailed there, it was known simply as Iron Bottom Sound. Because by dawn, there was always another ship lying on the seafloor. Helena's radar gave her an edge no Japanese ship could match. The new SG system could detect enemy vessels long before they were visible. Her operators, young, nervous men staring at green screens, were pioneers in a new kind of warfare. They would be the eyes in the darkness, guiding Helena's guns before the enemy even knew she was there. Barely a month later, Helena was called to battle again, this time in the brutal, chaotic fight off Savo Island. A massive Japanese bombardment force was heading south, determined to destroy Henderson Field and the Marines who held it. The Americans, led by Admiral Daniel Callahan, moved to intercept. It would be one of the most savage close-range engagements of the war. The fleets collided in total darkness. The range closed to under 3,000 yards, so near that searchlights and gunfire lit the night like day. Helena's radar detected targets, but the command confusion aboard the flagship delayed orders. When permission to fire finally came, Helena unleashed everything. Her 6-inch guns roared with mechanical precision, hurling salvo after salvo into the night. Japanese destroyers erupted under her fire, superstructures melting under the relentless impact. But the chaos was unimaginable. Friendly and enemy ships intermingled, explosions everywhere. A Japanese torpedo ripped into the cruiser Atlanta, killing Admiral Scott. Another torpedo hit San Francisco, killing Admiral Callahan. Helena fought on alone, her gunners firing by radar even as enemy ships slipped through the darkness. When the sun rose over Iron Bottom Sound, the water was choked with debris and oil. Both fleets were shattered, but Henderson Field still stood. And for that, Helena had again played a decisive part. Her guns, fast, disciplined, unstoppable, had blunted Japan's fury and saved the Marines on Guadalcanal. In the weeks that followed, the nickname spread across the fleet. The machine gun cruiser. Her fire rate had been unmatched, hundreds of shells per minute, every burst guided by radar, every hit precise and deadly. Enemy captains who survived called her a demon of the night, a ship that could see in darkness and kill before you even knew she was there. Between battles, the sea offered little peace. The men lived in cramped quarters, always soaked in humidity, their uniforms sticking to their skin. The smell of oil, gunpowder, and sweat never left. Sleep came in short bursts, interrupted by alarms or the rattle of distant gunfire. Yet morale was high. Helena had become a symbol, a ship that brought luck, that struck hard and came home. In the mess halls, sailors joked about riding the fastest gun in the fleet. They painted her name on bombs, carved it into shell casings, and carried her emblem as a badge of pride. Mail from home was rare, but letters were treasured like gold. A few sailors kept tiny snapshots of wives or sweethearts taped near their bunks, fading reminders of a world far away. And every night, when the sky cleared and the Milky Way spread across the Pacific, they'd stand on deck and stare at the stars. Many of them believed that somewhere back home, someone they loved was looking up at those same stars, waiting. By early 1943, Helena was one of the most experienced warships in the Pacific. She had survived Pearl Harbor, fought at Cape Esperance, and endured the carnage of Guadalcanal. But her mission was far from over. Halsey's fleet was now driving north through the Solomon Islands, taking the fight closer to Japan's defensive perimeter. Each island, Tulagi, New Georgia, Columbangara, was another step through hell, and Helena was leading the charge. She supported landings, shelled enemy airfields, and dueled with shore batteries so close that her gunners could see trees splinter under the impact. Her radar made her the eyes of the task force, her guns its beating heart. She was everywhere, striking fast, vanishing into the mist, then returning with the fury of a storm. But even for legends, fate waits. Because in the black waters ahead, in the narrows of Kula Gulf, Japan was preparing a trap, and the ship that had survived Pearl Harbor, that had fought like no other, was sailing straight toward it. By mid-1943, the tide of war in the Pacific had begun to turn. The Imperial Japanese Navy was reeling, and the once invincible empire was now fighting to hold what it had seized. But for the men of the U.S. Navy, and especially those aboard Helena, the fighting was far from over. The Solomon Islands campaign had become a grinding, relentless struggle. Night after night, Allied ships fought through tropical squalls and enemy ambushes. The names of places blurred together: Tulagi, Munda, Columbangara, Kula Gulf, each one another patch of ocean turned into a graveyard. Helena had earned her reputation, a veteran of every major naval battle since Pearl Harbor. She was fast, deadly, and proud. Her crew, hardened by months of war, trusted her like a living being. She had saved them more than once, but none of them knew that their ship's final test was coming, and that not all of them would come home. The moon was half hidden behind clouds, its pale light shimmering on the restless sea. Task Force 68, composed of the light cruisers Helena, Honolulu, and St. Louis, along with 4 destroyers, was ordered to intercept another Japanese Tokyo Express convoy heading for Kolumbangara. Their mission was clear: stop the enemy before reinforcements reached the island. Admiral Walden Ainsworth commanded the force. He knew these waters well, narrow channels where radar and reflexes meant the difference between life and death. At his center sailed Helena, under Captain Charles Cecil, a quiet, determined man with the calm confidence of a leader who trusted his ship and his men completely. The night was thick and tense. At 0:57 hours, Helena's radar picked up fast-moving blips to the northwest. Japanese destroyers. They were coming, just as expected. Ainsworth's order came across the fleet: open fire when ready. Seconds later, Helena's guns unleashed their fury once more. The machine gun cruiser roared to life, 15 6-inch guns spitting fire into the darkness at a blinding rate. Shell after shell screamed across the black waves, hammering the enemy. In the first minutes alone, Helena fired nearly 100 salvos, over 1,200 shells. Her radar-directed guns tore into the lead Japanese destroyers, lighting up the night with explosions and tracer arcs. But this time, the enemy was ready. The Japanese destroyers were veterans too, fast, stealthy, and armed with the most lethal weapon in the Pacific, the Type 93 long-lance torpedo. It could strike unseen from miles away, guided by compressed oxygen and devastatingly powerful warheads. And as Helena's guns blazed in the darkness, the light they cast became her undoing. At 1:57, radar screens aboard Helena glowed with echoes, but not of ships. Something was moving fast beneath the waves. A heartbeat later, a torpedo slammed into her starboard bow. The explosion ripped through the forward engine room, sending steel and flame hurtling through the air. Before the crew could react, a second torpedo struck amidships. A third hit seconds later. 3 direct hits, each one catastrophic. The sea erupted in white fire. Helena's entire midsection disintegrated in a blast that threw men into the air like rag dolls. The lights went out. Power failed. The ship buckled in two. For a moment, there was only the sound of tearing metal and rushing water. Then came the screams, orders shouted in the dark, men calling for help, others praying. Captain Cecil shouted over the chaos, "Abandon ship! Save yourselves!" But many refused to leave. Below decks, machinists and electricians fought to keep pumps running. Gunners stayed at their stations, firing until their mounts sank beneath the waves. Others scrambled to launch rafts, to pull the wounded up from flooding compartments. Within minutes, Helena began to break apart. Her bow and stern rose as the center flooded. The middle section sank first, swallowed whole by the Black Pacific. But the forward and aft sections, torn but buoyant, remained afloat, ghostly halves of a once-proud warship. Around them, the sea was filled with oil, debris, and survivors, hundreds of men clinging to life. The air was thick with smoke and steam. And somewhere in the distance, Japanese guns still flashed, closing in. Helena's destroyer escorts, Nicholas and Radford, risked everything to return to the wreck site. Under fire, they began pulling survivors from the water, one by one. Men half-drowned, burned, and blooded were hauled aboard by shipmates who refused to leave them behind. Every time the destroyers turned to make another pass, Japanese shells splashed closer. Still, they came back. Again and again. By dawn, nearly 700 men had been rescued, but about 275 were still adrift, scattered across miles of open ocean, clutching rafts, wreckage, or each other. Sharks began to circle. The tropical sun rose, merciless and hot. Their ship was gone, but their fight to survive was not over. For 2 days, the survivors floated, sunburned, dehydrated, and delirious. Some died quietly, others slipped beneath the waves without a sound. But a small group, about 88 men, drifted toward the Russell Islands, carried by the current. They reached a tiny coral reef, exhausted and starving. There, they were found not by the Japanese, but by friendly coast watchers and local islanders loyal to the Allies. In a daring rescue, the submarines USS Naval and USS Gato were dispatched to extract them. At night, under the cover of darkness, they surfaced just offshore. Helena's survivors, weak but alive, swam through the surf toward salvation. Each one carried the memory of those left behind. By the end of it all, 168 men of Helena's crew were dead, but more than 700 had survived, because of their courage, their training, and the relentless bravery of the men who refused to abandon them. When news of Helena's loss reached home, the nation mourned, but also remembered. She had survived Pearl Harbor. She had led the fight at Cape Esperance and Guadalcanal. And when her time came, she went down fighting, guns blazing until the very end. In the months that followed, her surviving crew members were reassigned to other ships. Many would fight again, at Kula Gulf, in the Philippines, even at Okinawa. Everywhere they went, they carried her spirit with them. The name Helena became legend, a word whispered with pride in mess halls and shipyards alike. In 1945, a new ship bore her name, USS Helena, CA-75, a Baltimore-class heavy cruiser. At her commissioning ceremony, the surviving sailors of the original Helena stood together in silence. They saluted the flag, then the sea, and for a moment, every one of them could still hear the thunder of those 6-inch guns, echoing across the Pacific. 75 years later, in 2018, a research team led by Paul Allen's expedition vessel Petrel scanned the depths of the Solomon Sea. At over 2,800 feet below the surface, the sonar picked up a familiar shape, long, broken, but unmistakable. It was Helena. Her bow and stern still lay apart, separated by nearly half a mile. Her guns rested silent, but her nameplate was still visible, glinting under the deep-sea lights. Time had not erased her, only preserved her. She lay there peacefully, surrounded by coral and silence, as if standing eternal watch over the waters where she had fought and died. When the footage was released, families of her crew wept. For many, it was the first time they had seen where their fathers, brothers, or grandfathers had made their final stand. It was closure. It was remembrance. The story of USS Helena is more than a record of steel and battle. It is the story of human courage, of men who refused to surrender, of a ship that embodied resilience itself. From the flames of Pearl Harbor to the depths of Kula Gulf, she lived up to the very spirit of her nation. Wounded, battered, but never broken. Her guns may be silent now, but in every ocean breeze, every ripple over iron-bottom sound, you can still hear the echo of her voice, the defiant thunder of the machine gun cruiser. When the sea finally grew quiet over the wreck of the USS Helena, the Pacific itself seemed to mourn. The ocean that had carried her into every battle now swallowed her whole, folding her into the dark cradle of eternity. But her story did not end beneath those waves. Far from it. The legend of Helena had only just begun to rise. In the days after the Battle of Kula Gulf, the Navy was shrouded in silence. Messages arrived slowly, reports were incomplete, and confusion swept through the ranks. Many ships had fought that night, many had taken damage, but few had faced what Helena endured. 3 torpedoes in the dead of night, and yet she refused to surrender until her very structure gave way. Her sinking was not a defeat, it was an echo of valor. A ship that had already survived Pearl Harbor had gone down not in retreat, but in battle, firing to the very end. Word spread through naval bases from Tulagi to Pearl Harbor, and then across the United States. Helena was gone, but her crew had fought like lions. Some were lost to the sea, others rescued by brave destroyers and coast watchers, but all were remembered as men who carried their ship's spirit to the final moment. In Washington, her name became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that American steel and American hearts would never bow to the rising sun. Across the ocean, shipyards that had once built the Helena carried her blueprints like sacred relics. Workers remembered her sleek frame, her unmatched radar, her speed, her precision. For them, she had been more than a cruiser. She had been a promise of what American engineering could achieve. Now, her destruction demanded an answer, and that answer would come in the form of new ships, new guns, and renewed resolve. By the late summer of 1943, the war in the Pacific was shifting. The Navy was learning, adapting, evolving, and Helena's sacrifice became part of that transformation. Her death was studied, her tactics analyzed, and her final transmissions replayed again and again by officers who sought to understand how to fight smarter in the island wars yet to come. In every report, one truth stood out. Helena had fought beyond the limits of expectation. She had proven what a light cruiser could do when courage outweighed armor. As months passed, the survivors who had been rescued returned to duty. Some joined other ships, others were sent home to recover. They carried the memory of Helena with them like a tattoo on the soul. The sound of her guns, the light of trace of fire slicing through darkness, the roar of explosions that shook the night sky. For them, the war would never be the same again. They had seen what it meant to give everything. Back home, in the quiet towns of America, telegrams arrived. Mothers, fathers, wives, and children read the words they feared. Missing in action, presumed lost at sea. Yet even in grief, there was pride. Communities rallied to honor their fallen, streets renamed, schools dedicated, flags raised higher. In Helena, Montana, the city that had given the ship her name, the news struck like a hammer. But rather than despair, the people responded with unity. They built memorials, held parades, and reminded the nation that the spirit of the USS Helena lived on in every heart that beat for freedom. The Navy would not forget her either. A new ship was commissioned, USS Helena, CA-75, a Baltimore-class heavy cruiser. She carried not only the same name, but the same fighting spirit. When she slid into the water in 1945, the ceremony was solemn, proud, and emotional. Among the crowd stood veterans of the first Helena, men who had lived through hell and watched their ship go down. As the new vessel glimmered in the morning light, they saluted, not the steel, but the legacy. A name reborn, a promise renewed. The new Helena went on to serve with distinction in Korea, in the Cold War, and as a floating testament to her namesake's courage. Her presence on the seas ensured that the story of the first Helena was never forgotten. Each time her guns thundered, it was as if the spirit of the lost ship spoke again across the waves, a whisper of defiance carried by steel and smoke. But even beyond the Navy, the legend grew. Historians began to study her role at Cape Esperance, her precision at Guadalcanal, and her unmatched record of gunnery. To them, Helena represented the transition from old warfight to the new, a ship that bridged eras, mastering radar, coordination, and night combat when such things were still new and uncertain. She was not just a weapon, she was a symbol of evolution, of ingenuity born under fire. As the decades passed, Helena faded into history's long shadow, but she never vanished completely. In museums and libraries, her photographs remained, rows of sailors smiling before battle, the sleek curve of her hull gliding across blue Pacific waters. In the months after the Battle of Kula Gulf, the Pacific carried its own kind of silence, a heavy quiet that fell over the waters where so many ships had gone down. The wreck of the USS Helena lay deep beneath those endless swells, untouched and unseen, hidden in a graveyard of heroes. But above the surface, her memory refused to die. The survivors who returned from the battle carried with them stories that could not be contained. They spoke of the night sky lit by tracer fire, of the thunder that came from Helena's guns, and of the blinding flash when the first torpedo struck. They remembered the sound, that deep metallic roar when the ship broke in two, and the strange calm that followed. They remembered the faces of the men beside them, and how courage was measured not in victory, but in the will to keep fighting when the sea itself turned against them. When they finally made it back to safety, many of them were gaunt, sunburned, and silent. Some had drifted for days, clinging to wreckage and hope. Others had been rescued by destroyers and submarines that risked enemy waters to bring them home. But none emerged unchanged. They had looked into the depths of war and seen both the fury of battle and the fragile thread that binds life to death. In naval hospitals across the Pacific, doctors treated the wounded, but no medicine could heal the invisible wounds left behind. Nightmares lingered, the flash of explosions, the scream of the sea, the faces of friends lost to the deep. Yet even in those haunted dreams, pride remained. They had fought aboard Helena. They had stood at the guns of a ship that had answered every challenge and defied every fate. Letters began to arrive at families' homes, official notices, printed with the Navy seal. For some, the words confirmed their worst fears. For others, there was a single line of hope, missing in action. Weeks later, a second letter might follow, rescued, safe in Allied territory. Each envelope carried a storm of emotions, grief, relief, pride. Communities gathered in churches and halls, holding vigils and services. The name Helena was spoken not with sorrow alone, but with reverence. It had become something larger than a ship, a symbol of endurance, of what it meant to fight for something greater than oneself. Back in Helena, Montana, the news brought both heartbreak and unity. The town that had given its name to the ship felt her loss as if she were one of their own. In the city square, flags flew at half-mast. Children laid flowers beneath a bronze plaque bearing the ship's crest. Veterans saluted in silence as the local band played Anchors Away. For a moment, the small inland city felt connected to the farthest reaches of the Pacific, bound by sacrifice and pride. Across the nation, newspapers carried the story. Headlines called her the cruiser that fought to the end. Photos of her crew, smiling, young, determined, filled the pages of Life and the Saturday Evening Post. To the American people, Helena was not just a ship. She was proof that courage could outlast steel. Even as the war raged on, her story became a rallying cry, a reminder that the price of victory was written in salt water and fire. Years later, as peace returned and the world began to rebuild, Helena's legacy continued to ripple outward. In naval academies, her battles were studied in detail, her radar coordination, her precision gunnery, her night-fighting tactics. Young officers learned that bravery was not found only in grand victories, but also in how one faced disaster. Every mention of Helena carried a lesson, that discipline and training could make a crew unstoppable, even when fate turned cruel. The men who survived went on to live full lives. Some stayed in the Navy, serving on new ships that carried her spirit forward. Others returned home, started families, built businesses, and quietly carried their memories with them. But each year, on anniversaries of the battle, they gathered, not in mourning, but in brotherhood. At reunions in Helena, Montana, or in quiet halls along the coast, they shared stories that had never left their hearts. Names were read aloud, toasts were raised, and moments of silence held. The faces grew older, the numbers smaller, but the bond never weakened. They were, and always would be, Helena's crew. As the 1950s and 60s passed, the Pacific War faded into memory for many Americans. New conflicts arose, new ships were launched, and the world turned its gaze elsewhere. But among naval historians, the name Helena still commanded respect. Her story was told in classrooms, in documentaries, in books that sought to capture the immense scale of the Pacific conflict. And for those who studied her, one truth remained unshakable. She had embodied the spirit of the United States Navy at its finest hour. Beneath the waves, her wreck lay silent. Fish swam through her corridors, coral clung to her hull, and the ocean slowly transformed her into a living monument. No one knew exactly where she rested, but those who had served aboard her believed that the sea itself guarded her, as if nature understood the weight of her sacrifice. For decades, she was spoken of like a ghost, a legend of steel and valor lost to the deep. And yet, the legend endured. Generations grew up hearing the name Helena, reading of her heroism in history books, seeing her image in museums. In naval ceremonies, her story was recited alongside the great ships of the Pacific, Arizona, Hornet, Enterprise, Indianapolis. She had joined that eternal fleet, sailing forever in the hearts of those who understood what her name meant. By the dawn of the 21st century, interest in the lost ships of the Pacific began to rise again. New technology, sonar mapping, and deep-sea expeditions allowed explorers to seek out what had been hidden for nearly 80 years. Among the names on every list, one stood out, USS Helena. Historians and engineers alike dreamed of finding her, not as a salvage prize, but as a way of closing a chapter that had remained open too long. They wanted to see her again, to look upon the ship that had fought until she could fight no more. In 2018, that dream became a reality. A private research team, led by philanthropist Paul Allen, embarked on a mission to locate the wrecks of several historic naval vessels. In the dark, cold depths of the Solomon Sea, their sonar painted a familiar shape, long, slender, and unmistakably armed. As the remotely operated vehicle descended, light illuminated twisted steel and silent decks. There she was, USS Helena, resting peacefully, 2,800 feet below the surface. Her guns were still in place, her bow still proud, her name faintly visible across her corroded hull. Time and pressure had changed her, but not erased her. The ship that had fought so fiercely still stood guard over her fallen. The world watched as images from the deep appeared on screens, grainy, ghostly, beautiful. For the first time since 1943, the Helena had been seen again. Her story had come full circle. The ocean had not forgotten her, nor had the nation. She was found not as wreckage, but as a monument, proof that courage leaves a mark that even the sea cannot wash away. When the news reached Helena, Montana, the city held a ceremony unlike any other. Flags lined the streets, bells rang across the valley, and families gathered once more. For many, it was a moment of closure, a reunion across time. Children and grandchildren of the crew spoke of the pride they had carried their whole lives. The ship that bore their city's name had been found, still whole enough to remind the world who she was. The U.S. Navy sent a message of respect, acknowledging that Helena's rediscovery was more than historical. It was spiritual. She had returned from the deep, her presence reaffirming the values that built her: duty, honor, and the unbreakable will to fight for freedom. As the last light of that day faded, the Pacific once again stretched into silence. But this time, it was not the silence of loss, it was the calm of remembrance. The Helena slept beneath the waves, her duty fulfilled, her name eternal. And above her, the stars reflected on the sea, the same stars her crew had once looked upon, the same stars that now watched over her rest. Before the thunder of battle, before the night skies flashed with fire, the USS Helena was a world unto herself. A floating city of nearly 1,000 souls, she moved through the Pacific like a living organism, every gear, every valve, every heartbeat in rhythm. Her decks rang with the sound of boots, her corridors pulsed with voices and laughter, her engines hummed like a distant heartbeat beneath the steel. Each dawn began the same way. A boatswain's whistle cut the morning stillness, calling the crew to stations. The smell of coffee drifted from the galley, mixing with salt and oil. Above, the first rays of sunlight turned her guns to gold, and for a moment the war felt far away. Men stood on deck, watching the horizon blaze orange, their minds caught between duty and memory, thinking of home, of faces left behind, of the promise that they would return. Discipline shaped every hour aboard Helena. Her crew moved with the precision of a clock, each man trained to perfection, each order carried like scripture. In the plotting rooms, young officers studied maps by red light, tracing lines of attack. Below, engineers tended the great boilers that fed her turbines, sweat shining on their backs as temperatures climbed past 100 degrees. Every man knew his place, and every man trusted the one beside him. That trust was what made Helena stronger than the sum of her armor. Between drills, there were moments of calm humanity. Letters were written on thin paper, folded carefully, and tucked into pockets until the next mail run. Photographs of sweethearts and children were pinned above bunks. Someone strummed a guitar on the mess deck while others played cards, laughter echoing off bulkheads. Even amid the machinery of war, life insisted on being lived. The ship's cook was a legend among the crew. With rations meant to last months, he conjured meals that felt like home. Fresh bread on calm days, hot stew on cold nights. When the seas grew rough, trays slid across tables and men laughed as they caught their food in midair. In those moments, the Helena wasn't a warship, she was family. On Sundays, when operations allowed, the chaplain held service on the main deck. Men gathered shoulder to shoulder, heads bowed beneath the open sky. The hymns were soft at first, carried away by the wind, but soon the voices grew strong, blending with the endless sound of the sea. It wasn't ceremony, it was connection. In those prayers, they found strength for whatever waited beyond the horizon. Training never stopped. Day and night, the gunners practiced, loading shells with fluid precision. The radar teams honed their craft, learning to read the mysterious green screens that glowed in the dark. Signalsmen studied flag codes and blinker lights until they could send messages faster than thought. Every skill, every repetition, was a promise, to each other, to the ship, to the nation they served. When liberty came, brief though it was, the crew stepped onto islands that smelled of rain and earth. Some bought postcards, others gathered shells from the shore. A few simply sat and stayed at the trees, grateful for silence. Then, at the sound of the recall horn, they hurried back aboard, because Helena was home now. Whatever waited inland belonged to another life. The ship herself seemed alive to them. She creaked and groaned, whispered in storms, and sang when the waves struck her bow. Sailors swore she had moods, calm before battle, restless when idle. Some said she could feel their courage through her decks, that she answered their resolve with speed and strength. To those who lived within her steel walls, she was not it. She was she. A guardian, a weapon, a friend. When orders came to action, the transformation was instant. Conversation stopped, laughter vanished, and purpose filled every corridor. Men took their stations, eyes fixed, hands steady. From the bridge to the boiler rooms, every heartbeat aligned to a single rhythm, the pulse of Helena. Her engines roared to life, turbines screaming with restrained power. Gun crews loaded, radar spun, and the ship cut through the sea like a blade drawn from its sheath. Between engagements, tension lingered. No one spoke of fear, but everyone felt it, an invisible passenger on every voyage. At night, the dark ocean stretched endlessly, and every shadow might hide an enemy. Yet somehow, the fear never ruled them. They had faith in the ship, in their captain, and in one another. In the unspoken code of sailors, courage was not the absence of fear. It was doing the job despite it. There were times of sorrow, too. When a comrade was lost, the crew gathered on deck in solemn silence. The chaplain's voice carried over the water, the flag draped over the rail. A single note from the bugle echoed across the waves, and the sea received its own. For a long time afterward, the men spoke little, but deep down, every loss became fuel for resolve. They would fight harder, aim truer, stand longer, because that was how they honored the fallen. As months turned to years, Helena's crew changed. New faces arrived, fresh from training schools, nervous but eager. Veterans took them under wing, teaching them not just procedures but the quiet wisdom of survival. Which pipe meant danger? Which rivet on the deck was always slick? Which corner to duck behind when the guns fired? In that exchange between generations, Helena remained young. The sea gave them every mood, gentle swells under golden sun, and furious storms that tested man and metal alike. When typhoons struck, the ship pitched through mountains of water. Every groan of her frame was a reminder of the power she defied. When calm returned, the deck glistened with sultan pride. They had beaten the sea again, together. Some nights, when the sky was clear and duties were done, sailors stood at the rails watching stars reflected on the black water. They spoke in low voices about what they'd do after the war, about the houses they'd build, the families they'd return to. Dreams, small and grand, floated above the hum of the engines. No one could know whose dream would survive the next battle, but hope itself became a weapon. Through it all, Helena remained a symbol of what men could become when bound by purpose. She was not merely steel and steam, she was resolve forged in human hands. And though storms, battles, and years would take her, that spirit could not rust, could not sink. It lingered, in the hearts of those who walked her decks, in the wake she left across the ocean, in the very idea of duty that built her. So when she finally met her fate in the dark waters of the Solomon Sea, she did not die as a machine. She passed into legend as a being of will and memory, carried forward by every man who had called her home. Night had fallen over the Solomon Sea, heavy and absolute. The horizon was a smudge of black upon black, even the stars hid behind high clouds. Only the low red lights of the bridge pierced the darkness aboard Helena. Her crew moved in silence, their voices hushed to whispers. Every man knew that the calm was not peace, it was the pause before the storm. For days they had been hunting Japanese forces around Kula Gulf, sweeping the islands to stop enemy reinforcements. Now radar screens glowed faintly, revealing contacts moving like ghosts in the distance. The message passed from bridge to gunnery control, enemy ships inbound. Captain Charles P. Cecil stood at the bridge wing, binoculars pressed to his eyes. He had seen too many dawns after nights like this, some victorious, some bitterly paid for. He spoke softly, more to himself than to the men beside him. Helena's ready. Below decks, engines hummed with restrained fury. In the magazines, powder bags and shells were lifted to ready racks. The ship's great 6-inch guns, 15 of them, waited in silence, barrels elevated toward the invisible horizon. The smell of oil and cordite filled the air, the scent of battle before a shot was fired. The order came down from the flagship. Prepare for surface engagement. No one cheered. There was no need. The crew had fought together for years. They knew the ritual by heart. Helmets fastened. Life belts checked. Watertight doors dogged shut. The last cigarettes were stubbed out on steel decks. The time for waiting had ended. At 1:57 a.m., Helena's radar locked on a target, then another. The silhouettes of Japanese destroyers crept within range. Captain Cecil gave the order in a calm, steady voice that carried through the intercoms. Open fire. Helena spoke first. Her forward guns erupted in flame, thunder cracking across the sea. 15 barrels unleashed a storm of steel, each salvo punching through the night like lightning. Shells screamed across the water, arcing high and striking true. In moments, the darkness was alive with fire. Other American ships joined in, the Honolulu, the St. Louis, the Nicholas, but it was Helena whose guns lit the Gulf brightest. Her rapid-fire 6-inch batteries spat flames so quickly that Japanese lookouts later swore she was on fire herself. Every flash revealed her position, yet she did not falter. The crew loaded and fired with the speed of a heartbeat. Each shell sent tremors through the deck, each impact somewhere out there tore metal and men apart. The enemy answered. From the black distance came streaks of light, the deadly signatures of long-lance torpedoes. They skimmed beneath the surface, invisible but inevitable. Helena's lookouts shouted warnings, but there was no time. At 2:03 a.m., the first torpedo struck. The blast tore through her forward engine room, a column of fire and water rising 100 feet high. Men were thrown against bulkheads, lights flickered and died. A heartbeat later, a second explosion ripped through her midsection. Then a third, dead center. Steel screamed, decks buckled, and in the chaos, Helena began to break. Water flooded in faster than pumps could fight it. Still, the crew did not yield. Damage control teams rushed below, dragging hoses, sealing compartments, fighting a losing war against the sea. Above, gun crews kept firing even as the deck listed. The gunners refused to let the Japanese slip away unpunished. Their shells roared defiantly into the night, each flash a heartbeat of courage. Captain Cecil's voice came through the intercom, calm and unshaken. "Stay at your stations. Keep firing. We will not abandon ship." But Helena was mortally wounded. Within minutes, she broke in two. The bow rose, pointing to the stars as though in salute, then slipped beneath the black water. The stain followed, vanishing in a thunder of bubbles and steam. Silence fell, an awful, endless silence broken only by the hiss of escaping air. Hundreds of men were thrown into the sea. Some clung to floating wreckage, others treaded water amid oil and debris. The night was filled with shouts, prayers, and the distant rumble of engines retreating. For a moment, the war felt impossibly far away. It was just men in the sea, locked in an ancient struggle for survival. Lieutenant Commander J.B. Shryock, the executive officer, rallied survivors to rafts and floating debris. He shouted orders through the deck. "Stay together. Keep your heads up. The current's with us." All around him, sailors answered, not with despair, but determination. They had lost their ship, but not their spirit. Hours passed. The sea grew cold. The night dragged on. Many drifted in silence, watching for dawn. In the east, at last, the sky began to lighten, a thin gray promise of survival. With the sunrise came rescue ships, weaving cautiously through enemy waters. The destroyers Nicholas and Radford appeared like ghosts, risking everything to find their brothers. When the first survivors were hauled aboard, they wept, not from pain, but from pride. They had kept faith with each other and with Helena. Their ship was gone, but her legacy had become something more than steel. It was the unbreakable bond of those who refused to surrender. As the destroyers turned homeward, carrying the weary and the wounded, the sea closed quietly over the place where Helena had stood her ground. Beneath those waters, the rest of her crew lay still, eternal watchkeepers of the deep. Captain Cecil remained with them. He had gone down with his ship, just as he had vowed. And so the legend of Helena passed into history, not as a tragedy, but as a testament. The courage of her men became a story retold wherever sailors speak of honor. Even now, in the quiet of naval museums and in the voices of families who remember, Helena sails again, her name carved not in steel, but in memory. Dawn rose slow and colorless over the Solomon Sea. The horizon, once lit by the fury of gunfire, now glimmered pale and hollow. Where the USS Helena had stood proud hours earlier, only oil, splintered timber, and drifting men remained. The sea was calm now, a cruel calm, as if it, too, remembered what it had taken. Groups of survivors floated together on rafts and wreckage. Some clung to splintered planks, others to one another. Many were burned, cut, or bruised, yet they kept watch for shapes on the horizon. Sharks circled lazily, drawn by the scent of oil and blood, but no one spoke of them aloud. They had already looked into death's eyes once that night. Lieutenant Commander J.B. Shryock took command of the floating survivors. He counted heads, divided them into groups, and ordered the strongest swimmers to help the weak. They fashioned makeshift sails from clothing, oars from broken beams, and pushed east toward New Georgia Island. The sun burned above them. The sea below scalded with reflection. Every movement was pain, but every stroke was a vow. To live, to remember. Hours stretched into day. Dehydration set in first. Salt crusted on lips, and tongues swelled. Some men whispered prayers, others sang softly to keep their minds awake. From somewhere came a cracked voice, hoarse yet steady, singing anchors away. One by one, others joined, until the melody drifted across the empty sea, a song of defiance to the silence around them. By afternoon, thunderheads gathered. The wind rose, rain fell hard and cold. The men lifted their mouths to the sky, catching water in cupped hands, laughing through exhaustion. For a moment, the storm was a blessing, fresh water, cool air, a reminder that the world still cared. But the sea is a fickle ally. Waves built higher, tossing the rafts apart. Night came again, and with it, isolation. Through that second darkness, flares appeared on the horizon, tiny bursts of white light. At first the survivors thought it was imagination, but then came the low drone of engines. American destroyers were returning. The Nicholas and Radford, their decks scarred from battle, had risked enemy waters once more. Their crews scanned the sea with searchlights, sweeping across the wreckage. When the first beam caught the faces of men afloat, a cheer erupted, weak, ragged, but full of life. The destroyers lowered boats and nets, pulling survivors from the water one by one. Hands reached down, hands reached up. No rank, no formality, just human contact, the oldest rescue in the world. Some were too weak to climb and were lifted bodily, carried to safety. Others refused to come aboard until their shipmates were found. On the Radford's deck, corpsmen moved quickly, wrapping blankets around shivering shoulders. Coffee, black and scalding, was passed from mug to mug. For many, it was the first taste of warmth in 12 hours. They sat silently, staring at the horizon where Helena had gone down. No one spoke her name. It hung in the air like incense. But not all had been found. 3 life rafts had drifted beyond sight, carried westward by the current. For those men, the ordeal was far from over. Day after day, they drifted beneath the merciless sun. They rationed a few crackers, caught rainwater in helmets, and prayed the current would bring them to land. At night, phosphorescent waves glowed around their rafts, making them feel adrift in a field of stars. On the 4th day, the survivors sighted a dark line on the horizon, Vella La Vella Island. With the last of their strength, they paddled toward it. When at last they touched sand, men kissed the shore and collapsed. Natives appeared from the jungle, wary at first, then understanding. With gestures and broken English, the islanders offered food, water, and shelter. They hid the sailors from Japanese patrols that searched the coast. For 2 weeks, the castaways lived in the dense green world of the island. They built fires only at night, when smoke would not betray them. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on palm leaves. Mosquitoes whined in clouds. Yet even in that primitive refuge, discipline held. They took turns standing watch, repairing rafts, and charting the stars by memory. To them, survival was another form of duty. Then, one night, distant gunfire echoed from the sea, the signal they had been waiting for. American destroyers had returned once more, guided by coast watchers and the bravery of the islanders. Lanterns flashed from shore, answering lights blinked from the dark horizon. In small boats, the survivors paddled out through the surf. They climbed aboard the USS O'Bannon and USS Nicholas, ships whose crews cheered until their voices broke. The rescued were gaunt, bearded, and hollow-eyed, yet their spirits were unbroken. They stood on deck, watching the island fade into darkness. Behind them, the jungle swallowed the traces of their struggle. Before them, the open sea stretched toward safety. When they reached Tulagi, naval doctors met them with disbelief. Many had lost 40 pounds, others bore burns and infections. Yet every man who could stand asked the same question: is there another Helena? They wanted to serve again. News of the sinking spread quickly across the Pacific Fleet. In mess halls and wardrooms, men spoke her name with reverence. She had fought like no other cruiser, swift, deadly, unyielding. Her gunners had fired until their decks gave way beneath them. Her captain had stood firm until the end. The Helena became legend not for how she died, but for how she fought. In Washington, telegrams began to arrive at quiet homes across America. Mothers and wives opened envelopes with trembling hands. Some read words of survival, others read words no one forgets. In small towns and big cities, blue stars and windows turned to gold. But alongside the grief was pride, the kind of pride that endures generations. Weeks later, survivors gathered for final ceremony aboard another ship. They stood at attention as the chaplain spoke. She lies now beneath the waves, but her spirit sails with every ship that bears a name. A wreath was cast upon the sea, drifting out until it vanished. No one moved for a long time. Yet from that loss came renewal. Plans were laid for a new USS Helena, a light cruiser that would carry the name forward. When she was launched in 1945, many of the original crew attended. They ran their hands along the hull, feeling the cold steel warm under the sun. It was not the same ship, but it was the same heart. For the men who had survived, life would never again be ordinary. Some returned to duty, others to families who could scarcely believe they were alive. Years later, they would gather at reunions, old friends bound by salt and memory. They would tell stories of laughter, of terror, of the captain's calm voice over the intercom. And when they spoke of the sea, their eyes always turned east, to the place where Helena sleeps. Years passed, but the memory of the USS Helena did not fade. In every port she had once visited, in every home that had waited for her return, her name lingered like a tide that refused to recede. The war moved on. New ships were launched, new battles fought. Yet among sailors, Helena remained a legend whispered between what shifts, a story told to the young about what courage truly meant. Her survivors carried her in their hearts as if she was still afloat. Some returned to sea, serving aboard other vessels, others found peace in quiet towns. But whenever the sea wind caught them, whenever they heard the distant sound of gulls or the low drone of an engine, they remembered her voice, the hum of her turbines, the echo of her guns, the heartbeat of steel that had once been home. In 1944, as the tide of war turned toward victory, the Navy authorized a new cruiser to bear her name, USS Helena, CL-113. She was larger, sleeker, faster, built with the lessons of the Pacific carved into her design. At her launching ceremony, survivors of the original ship stood at the dock, their uniforms pressed and medals gleaming in the sunlight. The band played, the crowd cheered, and as the champagne broke across her bow, one could almost feel the presence of those who had gone before. It was as if the spirit of the first Helena rose from the depths to bless the second. When she slid into the water, her name echoed across the bay. Helena sails again. The legacy did not end with the ship herself. In the city of Helena, Montana, the vessel's namesake, the townspeople built memorials to honor her and the men who had served aboard. Photographs lined the walls of schools and libraries. Parades carried her banner through Main Street. For a generation raised in the shadow of war, the Helena was not just a ship. She was a symbol of sacrifice and resilience. In homes across America, yellowed telegrams and faded photographs became heirlooms. Children grew up hearing stories of fathers and uncles who had fought on the Helena. Some learned to trace her final voyage on maps pinned to bedroom walls, following the route from Pearl Harbor to Kula Gulf with their fingertips. They asked the same questions again and again. What was she like? And each time, the answer was the same. She was brave. Decades later, as survivors aged and gray hair replaced youth, they began to gather again, first in small groups, then in great reunions that drew families from across the nation. The first reunion took place in the 1950s, in a hotel ballroom hung with banners of blue and gold. Men who had once stood together at battle stations now shook hands with tears in their eyes. They shared stories over coffee and laughter over memories that only they could understand. The pain had softened with time, but the pride had only deepened. Each year the gatherings grew. Photographs of the ship were displayed on tables draped in navy cloth. A model of Helena, carved by a survivor's hands, rested beneath the spotlight. When the bugles sounded taps, the room fell silent. Some bowed their heads, others stared straight ahead, seeing not the hotel walls but the black waters of Kula Gulf, where their friends still stood watch beneath the sea. By the 1970s, historians had begun to rediscover her story. Old battle reports, long buried in archives, were read again. Naval writers chronicled her rapid-fire gunnery at Kula Gulf, her speed, her precision, her heroism. Documentaries aired her tale on black-and-white television sets, and once more the name Helena found its place in American hearts. She was no longer just a ship. She was a testament to endurance, an emblem of what ordinary men can achieve when united by purpose. The ocean, however, never forgets. In the early 1990s, deep-sea expeditions began mapping the floor of the Solomon Sea. Using sonar and submersibles, explorers searched for wrecks lost to time. Among them, they found her. In 2,800 feet of water, resting upright on the seabed, the USS Helena still stood proud. Her guns were trained outward as if still guarding the horizon. Her hull, torn but intact, was cloaked in coral and silence. Even after 50 years, she looked ready for battle. When the news reached the families of her crew, there was a quiet sense of peace. The ship was no longer lost. She was found. Flowers were cast into the waves above her resting place. For the first time since that dark night in 1943, her story felt complete. The Navy declared the site a war grave, sacred ground. No divers would disturb it. No salvage crews would approach. There she would remain, forever on station, her flag now invisible but eternal. Each year, wreaths are laid in her honor. Sometimes a Navy ship will pass nearby, lowering her ensign in salute. In those moments, the sea itself seems to pause. At the Naval History and Heritage Command in Washington, a section of her hull is preserved. Nearby, a brass nameplate bears the words, USS Helena, CL-50, lost in action, July 6, 1943. Visitors stop and read, some knowing little of what she was, but all leaving with quiet reverence. Children trace the engraved letters with their fingers, as if touching a story written in courage. But her truest legacy lives not in museums or memorials. It lives in the descendants of her crew. Grandsons who joined the Navy because of stories told by their elders. Granddaughters who carry photographs of men they never met. Families who still gather each July to speak her name, to honor the ship that refused to surrender even as she sank. And so the Helena endures, not as wreckage, not as loss, but as light. She sails now in memory, in ceremony, in the quiet dignity of remembrance. In every naval officer's oath, in every sailor's courage, in every flag raised against the wind, a small part of her lives on. Time moves forward, generations change. But beneath the waters of Kula Gulf, her silhouette remains, steady, silent, unyielding. And somewhere far above, the stars reflect faintly on the waves, just as they did that last night. The Helena sleeps there still, her guns forever pointed toward the horizon, standing her final watch. History has a way of echoing through steel and salt. Long after the guns fall silent and the smoke drifts away, the lessons of one ship can ripple through decades, shaping fleets yet to be built and sailors yet to be born. So it was with the USS Helena. Her story became required reading at naval academies. Cadets learned not only about her speed or her gunnery, but about her discipline, the perfect harmony between machinery and men. In strategy lectures, her final battle at Kula Gulf was studied line by line, radar tactics, formation maneuvers, and the deadly cost of revealing position through gun flashes. In every discussion, instructors reminded their students that courage could never replace caution, but courage could redeem failure when all else collapsed. Through the 1950s, as America entered the atomic age, shipyards turned to new metals, new engines, new weapons. Yet in design rooms lined with blueprints, naval architects often kept a photograph of the Helena pinned above their desks. It was a reminder that technology alone did not make a warship great. It was the human heartbeat within the hull, the unspoken faith between captain and crew, that gave a vessel her soul. When the Cold War deepened, and fleets patrolled silent seas beneath nuclear clouds, the legend of Helena resurfaced in unexpected ways. Her name was invoked during training speeches to submariners and destroyer captains alike. Remember Helena? She fought until the sea took her, and even then, she fought. Those words became a code of conduct, a quiet challenge passed from generation to generation. At Pearl Harbor, where she had first fired in anger, a new memorial was erected. It bore no marble angels or grand statues, only a bronze plate engraved with the names of her crew. Tourists often walked past it, unaware of its weight, until a descent would stop them and say softly, "This one, she lit the night of Kula Gulf like the 4th of July." Then the visitors would fall silent, as if realizing that the freedom to walk that pier had been purchased by the men whose names they read. During the Vietnam War, some American sailors painted Helena's ghost on their gun turrets for luck. In the Persian Gulf, decades later, A cruiser's radio officer kept a tiny brass plate from the original Helena bolted to his console. Whenever the ship entered combat readiness, he touched the plate once, a small ritual of remembrance. No order required it, no manual explained it. It was tradition, one born of respect. Naval historians began to see Helena not merely as a casualty of war, but as a symbol of transformation. She marked the shift from an era of steel and instinct to one of electronics and precision. Her radar-directed gunfire at Kula Gulf was a harbinger of modern naval warfare, where unseen eyes guide unseen weapons through darkness. She had been, in many ways, a bridge between worlds, the last of the old and the first of the new. At the U.S. Naval Academy Museum, curators restored her ship's bell. When it rang on ceremonial days, the tone was deep and resonant, carrying through the halls like a memory made of sound. Visitors paused, feeling its vibration in their chests. Few knew that the bell had once called men to battle, to prayer, and, finally, to abandon ship. Now it called them to remembrance. Outside, on the academy grounds, a plaque bears the inscription, "Her decks are gone, but her spirit remains upon the waters." She stands the long watch still. Every new class of midshipmen passes it on their first day. Some glance up, others march past without notice. But by graduation, they all know her story. The name Helena becomes more than a chapter. It becomes a measure of honor. By the 21st century, digital archives and online memorials carried her memory into new mediums. Children who once traced her path on maps could now see her wreck in photographs taken by deep-sea cameras, her hull silent beneath blue light, her guns resting in eternal formation. Virtual museums allowed visitors to walk her decks again, rebuilt in pixels and light. And somewhere between technology and reverence, the ghost of Helena lived once more. When sailors of today stand on the bridges of Aegis destroyers or nuclear cruisers, they look out over the same restless Pacific. Their radar screens glow in colors far beyond what Helena's crew could have imagined, yet the same heartbeat hums beneath the noise. Discipline, brotherhood, endurance. In those quiet hours of watch, when the sea stretches endless and dark, some still whisper a simple thought. Keep the watch, Helena. Her influence continues in more subtle ways. Every safety drill, every damage control protocol, every shipboard training that emphasizes staying calm under fire owes a trace of its philosophy to lessons written in her blood and steel. When modern captains review after-action reports, they still read of Helena's precision at Guadalcanal, her relentless fire rate, her refusal to yield at Kula Gulf. Those notes, once typed on fading paper, remain alive in doctrine, shaping the unseen hands that guide fleets today. Her memory is also a mirror, reflecting the cost of courage. For every story of triumph, there is the reminder of loss. The Navy's remembrance ceremonies balance both, the pride of service and the silence of sacrifice. In that balance lies the truest legacy of Helena. So, she sails on, not in steel, but in the conscience of those who follow her wake. Every generation that takes to the sea inherits her lesson. That strength is fleeting without unity, and that even the mightiest ship is only as enduring as the hearts that man her guns. And somewhere, beyond radar range, where the water deepens and the light fades, the original Helena rests. Currents drift softly through her corridors. Coral blooms on her rails. Small fish dart through her open hatches, as if carrying messages from one world to another. If the sea has a memory, then it dreams of her still. The years after war are quiet in ways battle never is. For the families of the USS Helena, the silence was both a mercy and a wound. Letters stopped coming. Telegrams replaced handwriting. The sound of footsteps at the door could make hearts freeze. And yet, through grief, something powerful began to form. A fellowship bound not by blood alone, but by shared remembrance. In small towns across America, kitchen tables became shrines. A photo in uniform, a medal still polished by careful hands, a folded flag in a triangle of glass. Mothers told their children, "He was on the Helena," and those children grew up knowing the name as more than history. It was family. Every few years, survivors who had escaped the Kula Gulf gathered again. At first there were many, their laughter rough and sea-worn, their stories overlapping. They met in Legion halls and seaside motels, swapping tales about the night the ocean took their ship but spared their souls. As the decades passed, the reunions grew smaller. Fewer chairs, softer voices, more moments spent in silence. But each gathering began and ended the same way, with the reading of the roll. Name after name, voice after voice, until the room was filled not with absence but with presence. In the 1970s, one surviving officer began writing letters to families of those lost. He gathered records, photos, fragments of logbooks, and with them, he built what would become the Helena Association. Its mission was simple: to remember. They sent newsletters across the country, printed on plain paper but carrying the weight of sacred duty. Never let the world forget, they wrote. Museums soon joined that cause. At the Navy Memorial in Washington, a curator uncovered crates marked Helena CL-50. Inside lay artifacts of another world: a compass ringed with salt, a section of teak deck, a shattered pair of binoculars whose lenses still reflected light. Each piece told a story without words. Visitors leaned close to the glass, their reflections mingling with the relics, past and present merging for a breathless second. When Helena's bell was restored, the project became a pilgrimage. Metal workers treated it like a living relic. Divers brushed away years of corrosion until its surface gleamed once more. When they first struck it, the note hung in the air, deep, resonant, sorrowful. That sound crossed generations. Old sailors wept. Children looked upward, uncertain why the tone made their hearts ache. On Memorial Days, wreaths began to appear at monuments without instruction. Some were placed by families who had no direct tie to the ship, only to the idea she represented. A teacher in Ohio told her students the story each year, using Helena to teach not only war, but resilience. A sculptor in California carved her silhouette into driftwood and left it anonymously at a naval pier. A filmmaker in Montana traced the lost transmissions from her radio room and turned them into a short documentary that ended with the line, "Courage does not sink." The internet, decades later, wove the next thread. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren of her crew began to find each other through message boards and archives. They shared letters scanned from old trunks, photographs once thought lost. Voices that had been silent for 80 years now spoke again through digital screens. Each upload was an act of resurrection. In time, a virtual USS Helena museum took shape, part memory, part digital cathedral. Visitors could walk her decks in virtual reality, hear the sea lapping against her hull, see light filtering through shattered portholes. No explosions, no screams, only the steady rhythm of the Pacific, endless and forgiving. The narration within that digital memorial ended with a single whisper: "She stands a watch still." Beyond the screens, the human guardians remained. An old sailor's daughter kept his dog tags on a chain above her desk. Every year on July 6th, she placed them on the porch rail and let the morning sun warm them, as if bringing them back to life. Another family carried ashes to the Kula Gulf, releasing them at dawn. As the iron touched the water, dolphins surfaced nearby, a moment that felt less like coincidence than benediction. The U.S. Navy, too, continued to honor her. Whenever a new cruiser or destroyer was commissioned, an officer would mention the Helena in the dedication speech. Her spirit, they said, reminded sailors that valor is timeless, even when ships are not. Thus, her memory moved from history to heritage, not trapped in museums or textbooks, but living in rituals both grand and simple. A boy tracing her outline in a school project, a veteran pausing at her name etched in bronze, a sailor whispering a prayer before setting out to sea. These are the guardians now, ordinary souls holding an extraordinary flame. And so, as the sun sets on another century, the Helena continues to sail, not across the ocean, but through the hearts of those who remember. The sea took her body, time preserved her soul. In every bell that rings, every wreath laid, every name spoken aloud, she answers still. Steady, unbroken, eternal. For 75 years, the sea kept her secret. Currents shifted, storms rose and died, and ships crossed the same waters never knowing what waited far below. Somewhere in the black beneath the Kula Gulf lay a name carved in steel, USS Helena, untouched by light, but never by memory. Oceanographers often said that the Pacific forgets nothing. It hides, it changes, it guards, but it remembers. And in time, it would return what it had taken. In the early 21st century, technology gave humanity a new kind of sight. Satellites mapped the seabed with precision once reserved for the stars. Sonar pulses swept across the deep, drawing ghostly outlines of valleys and ridges never seen by human eyes. Among those searching was a small international team of naval historians and marine engineers, united by a single goal: to find the resting place of the Helena. They studied her final transmissions, the bearing of Japanese torpedoes, the drift of survivors in rafts and oil slicks. Every clue became a coordinate, every memory a calculation. After years of false starts, a research vessel named Petrel set out under a calm dawn in the South Pacific. Its hull carried drones, cameras, and the quiet hope of discovery. For days, the sea gave nothing. The sonar screens glowed with static. The depths refused to speak. Then, in the small hours of morning, a pattern emerged. Straight lines where nature drew none, a geometry too deliberate for stone. The crew leaned close. Steel, rivets, a hull torn but proud. At 2,800 feet, their cameras descended through a haze of blue twilight. And there she was, Helena. Her bow lay upright, her guns still pointing skyward as though ready for one last volley. The teak decking was gone, replaced by coral and silence. But her number, CL-50, was still visible beneath the silt, faint yet unmistakable. The discovery was not met with cheers, but with quiet awe. On the monitor, a single seahorse drifted past the barrel of her forward turret, a delicate guard over a warrior's grave. Someone whispered, "She's still standing the watch." News of the finding spread across the world. Families who had kept her photograph for generations wept openly. Historians compared sonar maps with wartime charts, confirming the identity beyond doubt. The sea had indeed remembered. Marine scientists approached the wreck not as conquerors of depth, but as caretakers. They mapped each corridor with gentle light, careful not to disturb the sediment. Cameras traced her shattered midsection, the path where torpedoes had torn through armor. Inside one compartment, a brass handle still gleamed faintly, untouched by corrosion, a relic of craftsmanship enduring beyond decay. From the footage, modelers built digital replicas of the ship in her final rest. Each rivet, each beam, each mark of battle preserved in 3 dimensions. Through technology, humanity could now walk her decks again, not in triumph, but in tribute. At naval museums, the images played on loop. The slow sweep of cameras across a bridge, the ghostly outlines of gun mounts now home to sea anemones, the hush of water carrying distant echoes of men long gone. Children stared in wonder, veterans stood silently, some with their hands pressed to glass as though they could feel the chill of that depth. Scientists called it a biological sanctuary. Life had claimed Helena as its own. Schools of fish moved through her open hatches. Corals draped her rails like garlands. The ship that once bristled with fire had become a cathedral of peace. In the years following her discovery, research continued, not to recover her, but to learn from her. Metallurgists studied how her armor resisted decay, using it to improve modern hull designs. Historians used photogrammetry to reconstruct her final minutes with precision, teaching new generations of sailors how bravery and disaster intertwine. And through it all, one truth resonated. Memory is not lost, it only changes its form. The expedition left a bronze plaque near the wreck, sealed against corrosion. Its inscription read, "Here rests USS Helena, CL-50. Guardian of freedom, witness to courage. May the depths keep her safe, until the seas give up their dead." The plaque was affixed by a robotic arm, its motion slow and deliberate. When it settled into place, the light from the submersible reflected off its surface like a final salute. Above, on the research ship, the crew gathered on deck. No music, no speeches, only the sound of waves and the soft hum of machinery. One by one, they dropped white roses into the water. The petals scattered, glowing in moonlight, marking the spot where steel met eternity. From that day forward, every chart of the Kula Gulf carried a new notation. Helena, war grave, protected site. No fishing nets, no anchors, no intrusion. Only silence, respect, and the eternal rhythm of the sea. In time, documentaries followed. The world watched as light touched Helena again, as her guns and decks re-emerged from legend into sight. For many, it felt less like discovery than reunion. The ocean had kept her safe, not lost, merely waiting. And so, the final chapter of her physical story was written not by battle, but by peace. The deep had taken her, and now the deep had given her back. Not to the war that made her, but to the humanity that remembered her. She remains there still, standing in the quiet blue, the guardian beneath the waves. The machine gun cruiser turned into a monument of calm. Even in darkness, she endures. Even in silence, she speaks. Night falls over the Pacific, and the horizon dissolves into silver. The same winds that once carried the smoke of battle now carry the quiet of remembrance. Somewhere far below, where sunlight cannot reach, the USS Helena keeps her post. The sea moves endlessly around her, currents like slow breathing, tides like the turning of pages. Sand gathers in her corridors, coral drifts over steel. Yet nothing in the ocean erases purpose. Purpose, once born, becomes eternal. When sailors of the modern fleet take their midnight watch, they sometimes feel her neigh, not in sound or sight, but in the discipline of their hands, in the stillness between heartbeats. They check their instruments, scan the radar glow, and for a fleeting instant they know that another generation once stood exactly so. Eyes forward, mind steady, trusting the rhythm of the ship beneath them. In this way, Helena has never truly sunk. She has merely changed her form. From metal to memory, from thunder to thought. Every nation that goes to sea carries ghosts. But some ghosts do not haunt, they guide. The spirit of Helena has become one such guardian. She whispers that courage is not loud, that heroism often dies quietly, and that faith in one's duty is its own victory. At naval academies, recruits still hear her name. At shipyards, her design echoes in every line of armor and curve of hull. In homes, her story passes from grandparents to grandchildren. This was her ship. This is what they did. Through these retellings, Helena has transcended the boundaries of time. She no longer belongs only to those who served upon her, but to all who believe that honor survives even the sea. When dawn breaks over Kula Gulf, the surface glows gold for a moment, and beneath that shimmer, her outline seems to rise, as if sunlight remembers what the deep has hidden. The ocean breathes once, and the world continues. Every warship ends, every legacy drifts. But there are few whose stories form constellations for those who follow. Helena is one of them, a fixed star in the vast chart of naval memory. She teaches that strength is transient, that duty can outlast death, that a single act of defiance can echo through centuries. And so, as the final words of this chronicle fade, we do not say farewell. We say, carry on the watch, for somewhere, in the deep blue silence, a ship still stands her post. Her guns are silent, but her purpose speaks. Her hull is cold, but her name burns bright. She is Helena. She endures. Forever,